Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. We really want to thank you for joining us and being on this journey with us in the Allender Center podcast. And I'm here with Dan today. And, it's been a while since we've been able to pause and have more of a two-way conversation with you, our listeners. And so many of you may have responded to this. We put out a call to our listeners to say, what are the questions that, are emerging for you that you'd really like us to address? And we had so many responses. And we've just felt really privileged to be able to hold your questions that you've entrusted us with, some of the requests for certain themes. And what we did is we tried to take a look at everything and say, what are some of the patterns and themes of these questions that are emerging? So we're going to spend the next few weeks engaging different themes that really emerged in our listener question. And today, we've decided it would be a good idea to take on the topic of bad theology.
Bad. It's such a funny thought, but it's really, I'm sorry, I can't help but think about the dogs that I've had the privilege of being owned by. But, like bad dog, bad. But, it's such a sweet gift to have had our listeners respond and to know that there are so many questions that deeply deserve direct engagement. And it's just impossible to do so. But we did find so many people asking about how, when you begin to deal with trauma, how it begins to reshape, reform one's own sensibility about self, about relationship with others, and even, of course, relationship with God. And therefore, that's why this question about bad theology has come to the forefront.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just want to say to those of you listening, we take this topic so very seriously, and it requires a very tender and yet wise nuancing, because the reality is theology in and of itself is not a neutral endeavor. It's an endeavor of the imagination that has shaped nations and laws and doctrines that have real life consequences and actions on a global scale, let alone the ways they play out in communities and families and in our lives. And so we have this deep conviction that bad theology is actually very dangerous, very deadly. We're seeing the impact of this play out in our very midst right now. The structures sociologically, historically, and religiously that have been a part of creating and sustaining racism and racial injustice in the United States of America have been undergirded by theological imagination, by biblical principles. Our theology is not neutral. It has the power to perpetuate and sustain systems of death using God, using our biblical imagination to sustain it. So we take this very, very seriously. And so when we hear people crying out and saying this must stop, when some of us, much to our horror, are waking up to a pervasive reality that we should have been able to see all along, we have to come back to our theological assumptions and ideologies with a hermeneutic that says enough is enough. We want to see God more clearly. And just to give you a resource, more about the history of the church in America and how it has participated, and I know that's a hard word to hear, participated in creating and sustaining racism in the United States of America, of perpetuating the construct of whiteness as an elevation and a supremacy that is so anti-gospel, so in defiance against who God says we are as the multi-ethnic kingdom that's bringing about justice and mercy. I would encourage you to read The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism by Jemar Tisby. You can find it pretty much anywhere you get books. And again, it's just a comprehensive look at the historical, sociological, and religious journey of the United States of America from our earliest days. And these are the kind of resources we need to see, because theology is not ahistorical. It is this sense of our understanding and study of God that's playing out in our lived reality, what we understand to be true and how we live that out. And one of the things I love about the biblical text, and I also find horrific, but I love, is that it does not whitewash a single detail of what happens with the people of God as they encounter God, understand what it means to be people who do justice, who love mercy and walk humbly. And then they forget. And then they become the very people that makes God livid. They oppress. They build systems that oppress. And we need to be able to see our own story, to understand where we have become a people who profess to know God, but who have actually lived in such a way that God is very far from us. So again, we need help sometimes seeing that story, especially as white believers, because part of the structure of whiteness has asked us to not see what is true. So again, that's just a resource I would deeply encourage you to check out. The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby.
I think we're seeing it even in response to the COVID-19 era, the issue of human freedom. Don't tell me what to do. I'm an American. And so that theology of independence and the right to my own freedom, as much as I love that, our church, for example, began addressing how we would handle this era. And our pastor said, we will not operate out of fear, but out of love.
Right.
And just that alone is a theological perspective that I think shapes something of how we as a congregation in the Pacific Northwest are approaching not meeting, not because we have the right to, but because we want to serve our community and one another and not endanger, but not do harm. So if theology, oh my goodness, becomes the lifeblood of how we literally have a lens to look at life. And so bad theology, as you put it so well, Rachel, is not just an academic intellectual process. It really is life determining.
So we take this very seriously. And we also understand, as Dan named, that when you start to engage trauma, it becomes a dynamic unfolding journey that does expose what I would say is mostly, as you gain healing, as you grow in a capacity to love with more compassion, more of a sense of courage, more of a sense of justice, it starts to expose places where bad theology has actually reinforced harmful, abusive structures and behaviors. I also just want to say the other side of that is we also hear a lot of people asking, this kind of connection between trauma and sin, and where does one stop and the other begin? So we also are going to take into account that aspect, that theological question in this conversation.
Well, let's just jump in and say that bad theology is not a theology you don't believe in. It's not the fact that, though I do hold certain theological perspectives, the fact that I wouldn't hold the same view of baptism that you may hold, or the same view of how a church is to organize itself as a entity. Again, we have to be able to say that there are lots of things I don't agree with other believers, but that does not mean I think they hold to bad theology. Differences cannot just be labeled as good or bad, but there has to be a lot more to that than just the reflection. So when we begin to talk about bad theology, it's to me, we have to begin to go, from where, from whence, from whom, from when did this particular theological perspective come to be held by at least a group of people? So in other words, we can't engage so-called bad theology until we begin to do the work of studying it. And that study must come from not just a desire to label something good or bad, but to actually say very little about bad theology doesn't at least address something of concern that we can learn from. I may not be able to agree with it at all and might actually think it's deeply destructive, but there's an impulse in it that I need to understand in order to be able to come to eventually label it as something that I view as either destructive or different or actually very constructive. All theology is a movement of attempting to take something of the scriptures into a realm of applicability. So again, an obvious point, the Bible is from whence we develop our own theological perspectives, but that's always an interpretive process where the bias of a particular age or group of people or an understanding of life itself shapes how we come to look. It's a point of view, and that's why you always have to be asking, what are the assumptions underneath the reality of what I'm believing? There was an era in which people literally believed it was right to own another human being. In other words, deeply committed people who had some love of God actually believed that owning another human being was justified and given ground by Scripture. And to say, well, yeah, that requires an interpretive grid that indeed, thank the living God, is viewed in our day as deeply, profoundly flawed. There was a day in which manifest destiny, the assumption we have the right to take the ground we land on and dispel the people who were living here before because we get to Christianize them by taking over their world. Manifest destiny justified goodness, levels of injustice, cruelty, mass murder in ways that are unconscionable. So, as you said, Rachel, these categories require us to come humbly into our world to be able to say, where are we today holding views about God, about life, about property, about how to live well in our world that 100 years from now, people will be coming back to going, I cannot imagine how somebody who said they love Jesus could operate in that particular way.
I think when you're in the midst of coming to terms with the harmful theology that either you've been formed by or you're aware people you love have been deeply formed by, but make no mistake about it, in the world in which we live, there is so much theological imagination that is actually quite harmful. That's more like the air we breathe. And Dan, you're naming some of those, people might say are more just like political ideologies that were deeply theological. They were coming from a biblical study of God imagination. When we start to encounter these, you're going to be able to tell when something might be a little bit off base if there's no room for critique, nuance, or alternative views. Where, as you named, there's actually the absence of humility. Because any theological framework is meant to be engaged by a diverse community. That's how the Bible is intended to be held and engaged. And I do think it's really interesting when we talk about theology coming out of the text that we often don't want to actually look at the stories of the people of God who continually adopt really terrible theology, really terrible views about who God is, who God says they are, what they're entitled to, what they're not entitled to, and how many times like the prophetic voice of God has to come and say, you are actually murderous and idolatrous, and you've missed the whole point, and you have forgotten who I am, who God is. And now we got to kind of like correct this. And there's going to be a lot of destruction and exile and all kinds of things. So I always think it's interesting when anyone has a view that you can't even have engagement around. It's just this sense of like, this is the total absolute truth. And if you question it, not only are you questioning my authority, you're questioning God's authority. That's one way I think we can just kind of start to go, ooh, something's off here. Or just a theology that scapegoats and turns another way of thinking and makes it evil. And there's a big difference between being able to say, this is actually a harmful, destructive, evil theological framework. But anytime someone, a person, a people group is being scapegoated as a way to dehumanize, you know you're in the realm of bad theology.
Oh, yes. I mean, you're taking apart the very core of the beginning of the gospel, Genesis 1:26 through 28. We are all made in the image of God. And so to start with human dignity, and wherever it is besmirched by turning, in one sense, life and the work of God against a group of people, you already have something of that flavor of bad theology. But in many ways, I would say bad theology, truly bad, generally is about the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And we're not going to spend literally more than a moment to say that, Docetism, which was one of the earliest heresies in the early first century, people actually believe that Jesus didn't come in a body, that he didn't actually have a body. Well, if Jesus didn't have a body, then his death is meaningless. And therefore, his resurrection is actually just more of a metaphor. So when you start messing with justification, the work of Jesus, who is he? What has he accomplished on our part? Then I would say we're in destructive understandings of the scripture. But when we begin to go, wait a minute, the fact that the church has lived through Gnosticism, Arianism, questions about the Trinity, when we come into our world, particularly the world of trauma and abuse, as you brought up, one of the core issues of what I would consider to be the issue of sanctification, where there is the assumption that if you just know Jesus, just pray, just trust him, there will be no effect of trauma in your life and your body. And if there is, it's an indication that you really don't believe. You really have failed to believe in the work of Jesus. If I can make it a little abstract, it's a form of docetism. It's almost like saying, not only was Jesus not in the body, but you're not to be in your body. Trauma ought not actually have any effect on your body. And that, oh my goodness, one of the deep heresies through the church has been this notion that the body actually has no value. It's more like a husk, but what matters is your soul. And if your soul is engaged with the goodness of God, then your body is really incidental. It will come along like the tail of a dog wagging when you simply trust the good things of God. And I just want to go, what a pile of poo-poo. I mean, it's the denial of Jesus as a body, and ultimately us being denied that our body is our very being. And to think that trauma doesn't have an effect, oh my goodness. I call that a denial of both justification and the work of sanctification.
And I mean, come on, the incarnation changes everything. And I'm interested in the great high priest who has gone before me in every way, the one who intercedes on my behalf, who knows what it is to be embodied, to be human, because there is something about our createdness and who God made us to be that involves a body. And actually, I don't even think you could articulate a soul without a body, because your brain is a part of your body. And your emotions are actually like deeply embodied. So to me, I feel the sadness of what is lost when there's such a splitting off and dismissal, not only of Jesus's body, but our bodies. And man, I mean, so much of what we know about trauma is you cannot heal from trauma without engaging the body. And I think God loves our bodies and called them good when God created us. And I put my hope in the resurrection that someday we will be a part of the new heaven and the new earth, and that I will have a body. That's my body.
Well, and if we take this just that step further to say Platonism or Neoplatonism is so wed into our current understanding, like the notion that if you just get the intellectual understanding of the truth of God clear in your head, that somehow that will radically change how your body, your emotions engage. That's not biblical. It's Platonic. It's the notion that somehow there is, emotions and your body are weak and ephemeral, but your thinking is actually in the form of Platonic idealism. It's a form of literally God's thought. So if you think right, you will be right. And that has been, oh my goodness, so contrary to the incarnation, contrary to Jesus suffering in his body and engaging his own Father in the midst of the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? As if he only knew who God is, only trusted God better, he would never have cried out with that level of agony. This is where, as we push against the issue of bad theology, particularly with regard to trauma, I think there are two sides. One side is you should just get over it. If you just knew the truth, if you just trusted God, you wouldn't have to suffer.
If you just dismissed about, half, if not more, of the biblical text. And I'm talking about the Psalms and Lamentations and wisdom literature and all the places you're naming where there are utterances and expressions of sorrow and bodily sorrow and protest and rage that are in our text as valuable, valid, full expression of what it means to be faithful people of God.
Well, and to go further to say that, again, the Psalms are the hymn book of the people of God in the context of temple worship, outside of it as well, but nonetheless calling out one's confusion, heartache, anger. The fact that the psalm has a beginning, a middle, and an end doesn't mean that's equivalent to the same period of time that we resolve the realities of our own struggle with God. It names it, it doesn't resolve it. And so that notion that, well, you've read the psalm, now you should be resolved. Again, it's not just bad theology, it's just bad humanity.
Well, and you were saying, there are really two sides to this. One, the sense of like, just believe the right thing and get over it. What would you say is the other side?
Well, several questions came up from our listeners about, does trauma sort of give you a out of jail card? Does it justify our sin? And in many ways, it requires us to go back to that question. Well, what do we understand sin to be? And I think even in our day, we think of it as primarily behavioral, so that we deal with sin by a form of sin management. We stop doing certain so-called sinful things, and now we're no longer bound to sin. When Scripture couldn't be clearer. This is an issue of the heart, no less our behavior, but first and foremost, behaviors can change without the heart being altered. In fact, you can change behaviors and actually become more arrogant, more self-righteous. So behavioral change, I don't want to ever minimize, but it's just not the core of the gospel.
Well, I think the other, thing we have to hold when we're talking about sin is the biblical understanding of sin is fragmentation, a breakdown of trust, of union, of capacity to flourish. And it's a deeply personal reality of the heart, but it's also this pervasive, dynamic system that is, this power of sin and death over us. And I think when we're in the realm of trauma, we are in that realm of what is the corporate collective system that's perpetrating trauma. And then what are the personal ways, in some ways, we align with that system? So when we're talking about sin and trauma, it's both never an out of jail free card. Why? Because the telos is love. I mean, ultimately, we are called to be people who follow after Jesus and grow in our freedom to love and to love others, to love ourselves. And in that expression is part of how we love God. So yeah, there's this sense of holding both. So for me, I get really passionate when sin is used to code behavior that then makes it just a moral failure of a person without looking at the greater sin of the system.
Indeed.
Or of the oppression, or understanding that sometimes sin is the impact of harm. So, let's look at anxiety. Someone who struggles, I'm probably speaking for myself, someone who struggles with fear as a pervasive reality to deal with the trauma they experienced. And if that fear is only recoded as sin, in sin language, as a moral failure or a lack of faith, it's like we're heaping heavy burdens on already burdened people. We're not getting to the root failure of love that's actually there. And then, yes, dealing with the places where more healing needs to come. But love is always the end goal. We don't get a free pass just because the impact of sin in our lives kind of wreaks more sin. But I also don't think it's wise and good and biblical to punish people and heap heavy burdens on already burdened people without doing anything to lift it. So I'm always so much more interested in how do we start to unload and unburden some of these things so that people, both systemically and interpersonally and intrapersonally, so that people can actually be on a path of healing that increases their capacity to love.
Our experience of trauma is indeed being sinned against. And the fact is, we do metabolize other people's failure of us in a natural movement away from our own grief, from our own shattering, from our own capacity to actually call out and ask for help. So if the natural impulse of a fallen human being is ultimately to depend upon themselves rather than on the goodness of God, then the fact is, indeed, trauma intensifies what's there for everyone. And that is their own lust and their own anger, their own desire to fulfill their own emptiness, but also to make people pay for the harm that they've endured. So in many ways, I know this will sound awful, but working with traumatized people, I find so much more refreshing, so much easier than people who supposedly have not suffered trauma, because the level of denial, the level of self-righteousness, so often in those who have not suffered, they don't hear their own heart's lust. They don't hear and experience their own heart's anger in the way that often those who've been traumatized do. So in many ways, what I would say is, it's not so much that a traumatized person sins more, it's that a traumatized person knows the brokenness of life, their own and others, with so much more clarity. There's so much less bullshit. And as a result, oh my gosh, so much more room to engage. But when those with bad theology come around and say, your anger, your hurt, your struggle is ipso facto proof that you don't trust God. What I want to say is, no, those who are denying reality and yet might have the veneer of a high level of spirituality, those are the people who are denying the reality of God in ways that, well, obviously, maybe I'm feeling a little passion at the moment.
I just think we're in the realm of all those parables about like, who is the person who actually understands the kingdom of God and understands love and understands forgiveness. It's usually the people who have been forgiven more. It's the people who have more humility. So again, you hear us playing with this sense of, we can declare openly we're all sinners. We all participate in structures and systems and in beliefs and behaviors that we know are contrary to the heart of God. However, what we need in those moments is someone to actually do the hard work to enter the debris and the terrain of our hearts with curiosity, with courage, and with compassion. And that sense of, we're going to contend with evil systems with a kind of courage and justice that we know God means us for. And we're going to tend to human hearts with kindness and compassion. And so I think self-righteousness is so destructive. And I think it actually keeps us from the heart of God. And I can name that in my own life. And as someone who is constantly in a process of healing, I also don't get to use my rough edges. You know, like when I'm anxious, I'm not like scared a lot. I mean, I'm scared, but the way it comes out is anger. And I don't get to just be like to my husband or my children, like, sorry about it. Like, I'm an angry person because I've been traumatized. It's like, no, I want to be grieved every time.
Let's be clear too, though. I want you to engage your husband and your children, but also your podcast friend.
When I'm angry at Dan, and
we cannot excuse our style of relating as if it's inevitable because of the harm that's been done to us.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we have to bless that in many ways, the cacophony that's come through the harm of abuse, the living God chooses not only to work to transform, but actually to participate in the larger symphony that he's creating through us and with us. So again, what we can come back to as we end is to say, when you bear the burden of somehow changing overnight to not be behaviorally who others don't want you to be, don't concede to bad theology by thinking it's immediate. On the other hand, don't use the harm that's been done as a justification for, in many ways, perpetuating a lack of love for yourself and for others, and ultimately for God. Can we hold the tension and move forward? That's the reality of maybe one of the most important theological constructs, the already and not yet. Hi, everyone. I wanted to pause for just a moment and let you know about a special way you can help support this podcast and the Allender Center. We're a nonprofit organization, which means every year we have to raise a certain amount of our budget to support trainings, online courses, workshops, this podcast, and more. And it's thanks to the generous hearts of people like you that we can do this work of training people to step into stories of harm to find healing and redemption.
And we really have so much to thank you for, so much more to thank you for. But the truth is, this year has been really different. COVID-19 has changed many of the ways we're able to connect, train, and learn with our participants. And maintaining these new ways of connection has come at a cost. We still have about $200,000 to raise to close the gap in our budget before the end of our fiscal year. And Rachel, what do you have in your purse?
My inhaler and
you do
some lip gloss.
A lip gloss. Any spare change?
I will be honest with you. Any spare change I have to give, I'm definitely willing to give.
And for me as well. And if we had a donor who was willing to give $100,000 just straight out, I will make the commitment. I will come to your house and cut your lawn once COVID-19 has a cure and or a vaccine. We'll virtually do anything to get to that point of being able to close that point of 200,000. However, thanks to a very generous donor, every gift made between now and midnight on June 30th will be matched dollar for dollar up to 100,000. Any gift, big or small, will put us one step closer to meeting our goal. Look, your support means we'll be able to create new virtual learning opportunities, making training and story work and trauma care even more accessible. Look, the work grows more important each day as our communities continue to bear the weight of COVID-19 and racial injustice. Will you join us? You can give right now by going to www.theallendercenter.org/give. Thank you. Thank you so much.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.